mentioned earlier this evening about their new capital, which will be located in the center of the country, carved from territories of 3 major regions, much on the model of our own experience in Washington. In any case, many people do see Nigeria, of course, as an experiment in federalism. Other people are struck by Nigeria, by its importance in the world today to North-South relations, the importance to the United States with respect to the immediate question of oil. Nigeria is the second largest exporter of oil to the United States after Saudi Arabia. And many people think of Africa of Nigeria as being especially critical to the development of the African continent. And some people foresee a future for Nigeria as a great power in the 21st century. We're fortunate that the ambassador from Nigeria has agreed to meet with us. The ambassador was educated in Nigeria in his early schooling, and in fact remarked this evening about his university education, being one of 28 students in their only university. I was tempted to originally remark that he had received his higher education in Nigeria, but that would not have been a vivid enough statement of his actual experience. He has also received an academic diploma in education from the University of London, and he studied international relations at Queen's College, Oxford University. His career in the service of his state has been extensive. Let me only very briefly mention a few of the positions which he has held in order to give you a flavor of his experience. He's held positions in Madrid. He served, of course, in his foreign ministry in Lagos. He served in London, in Zaire, in the Federal Republic of Germany as ambassador to that state, as ambassador to Liberia. He's been director of the European Affairs Department in the Ministry of External Affairs in Lagos. He was a delegate to the Commonwealth Conference in Jamaica. He's been a member of the Nigerian delegation in bilateral talks with the Soviet Union. He's been director of the Administration and Finance Department in the Ministry of External Affairs, and a member of the Nigerian delegation to the United Nations General Assembly before becoming, in 1977, ambassador to the United States. He's agreed to talk with us this evening about Nigeria's place in the world, its place in Africa, its present and future, and Nigerian-American relations. It gives me a great deal of pleasure on behalf of our Board of Trustees to welcome this evening the Ambassador of Nigeria to the United States, His Excellency Olijimi Jolaoso.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I want to thank the Baltimore Council on Foreign Relations for inviting me to be with you tonight and to share some of my thoughts about the bilateral relations between the United States and Nigeria and what we in Nigeria are trying to do on the continent of Africa. I was rather taken aback at the very positive and big things that Dr. Claude said about Nigeria being a power in Africa and in the world. I think what we are trying to do is a modest beginning and to contribute as much as our resources allow us to the betterment of that mass of land that used to be called the Dark Continent. I think I'm going to limit myself primarily to our role in Africa and the relations between Nigeria and the United States in order to serve as a framework for whatever discussions may follow later. in October of last year, President Shehu Shagari of the Federal Republic of Nigeria came to New York to address the United Nations General Assembly. On that occasion, he was invited to pay an official visit to Washington by the President of the United States. It was the second official visit of a Nigerian chief of state to the White House in 3 years. And during that period also, the President of the United States had paid an official visit to Nigeria, making him the first United States President to visit Africa officially. These exchanges were signs of a relatively new cordiality in the relations between our two countries. For this has not always been the case. There had indeed been a time when a Nigerian chief of state came to the United Nations to address the Assembly. And in spite of our very best efforts, we could not secure an invitation for him to visit the White House, because the then president was spending his weekend in San Clemente. There was also a time when the Secretary of State of the United States could not obtain a visa to visit Nigeria. In other words, we have come a very long way in a very short time to the present. A present in which it is possible for President Ronald Reagan to write to President Shehu Shagari on taking office, and I quote, "I am delighted to be entering office at a time when the United States-Nigeria relations are cooperative and cordial," unquote. In order to understand this positive development in our bilateral relations, we must examine the dynamics of those relations. Basically, these relations are determined by an interplay of our respective foreign policy objectives, both explicit and implicit. In this country, for example, any discussion of your foreign policy invariably turns to a consideration of your ideological position relative to that of the Soviet Union, your stand against the Soviet Communist plan to dominate the world, and your national security objectives. Therefore, your relations with most of us in the developing world are determined by your perception of our position on the ideological spectrum and how vital we are to your national security interests. In fact, that has become very obvious in the foreign policy pronouncements of the present United States administration. On our side, each succeeding administration since we became independent in 1960 has maintained and demonstrated the basic principle that Africa is a cornerstone of Nigeria's foreign policy. Although there have been variations in emphasis in the way in which different administrations in Nigeria have tried to give expression to this fundamental principle, depending on issues at hand, we have been consistently faithful to it. Indeed, the writers of our present Constitution did consider it fit and proper to spell out the foreign policy objectives of the nation as follows, and I quote, "The state shall promote African unity, as well as total political, economic, social, and cultural liberation of Africa, and all other forms of international cooperation conducive to the consolidation of universal peace and mutual respect and friendship among all peoples and states, and shall combat racial discrimination in all its manifestations." End of quote. A dimension inherent in the foregoing enunciation of our foreign policy objective, which is not quite explicit but has been developed over the years, is that Nigeria is truly non-aligned in its pursuit of that universal peace and mutual respect and friendship among all peoples and all nations. The late Prime Minister of Nigeria, Sir Abubakar Tafawa Balewa, on the floor of Parliament in Lagos on the 16th of August 1960, on the eve of independence, in enunciating the tenets of the foreign policy of Nigeria, stated at the time that we would be truly non-aligned, that we would not, as a matter of course, belong to any ideological bloc. He explained that we would consider every subject on its own merit and come to our own conclusions on them. I do not think that anyone has deviated from that ever since. Our main preoccupation as a developing country, therefore, is neither ideological nor military. We are dedicated to achieve those conditions that will permit the total development of our people within Nigeria and in other parts of Africa. We wish to use our internal strength and resources to this end, whatever it takes. And we know that it will take the maintenance of friendly relations with other nations. We know that it will not take subservience to any ideological posture. It will require mutual respect and interdependence, and so long as we respect each other's dearly held principles and do not needlessly hurt each other's susceptibilities, so long as we do not attempt to coerce or intimidate others to lean to our point of view, we are sure to achieve this goal. We will cooperate with others in our search for that international peace and security, consulting on and consolidating the areas of agreement and seeking to narrow the areas in which we differ. As people with a colonial history, our goal is to help in the total liberation and decolonization of all parts of Africa. And as the largest black country in the world, it is our purpose to achieve respect and dignity for the black person everywhere in the world. It is in the light of the foregoing examination that one can see how the health of our bilateral relations with the United States has varied from very poor sometimes to very good at other times. During the Kennedy years, relations were reasonably good. For, as a developing country that needed the skills and resources of your advanced technological development, we received substantial support from your government. An example of that substantial support was the Peace Corps program, which had a tremendous impact on our people. In a succeeding administration, which coincided, unfortunately, with the period when we suffered an internal upheaval and a civil war which sought to tear our country apart, certain elements within the American legislature and in the country at large saw to it that the federal government received little or no aid from the government of the United States. The special interest lobbies, some of them interested in human rights, and others, in order to promote their religious connections, ensured that in our time of greatest need, it was the so-called underdog. It was the rebellion within our body politic that received both the sympathy and the help of the majority of the American people. We sought to purchase military hardware for cash from the United States, but were turned down by the administration. We were constrained to go to seek other sources from which to purchase the hardware needed to fight for and to preserve the unity and integrity of our nation. That alternative source at the time was the Soviet Union. Fortunately, Nigeria was in a position to pay cash and nothing else for that help. The moral here is twofold. Firstly, it is like when you forbid two young lovers to see each other. All you do is drive them together, and then they elope and get married. The second moral here is that those countries fighting either for their independence or for survival, with little or no resources of their own, appreciate prompt and appropriate assistance, irrespective of the ideological origin of such a help. If they must pay for it in ideological conversion and commitment, then they will. But that is the privilege which they will exercise when they have achieved their primary goal. There are some countries in our part of the world today which have found themselves in the latter category. The former Chief of State of Nigeria, General Olusegun Obasanjo, once described these countries as an example of the failure of Western colonialism in Africa. That if they had been prepared for independence and given the sense of security that they needed, there would have been no reason for them, in the first instance, to flirt with the East. It is not so long ago that any mention by the media and the Congress of Mr. Robert Mugabe and his compatriots fighting for Zimbabwe's independence regularly referred to them as Marxist-oriented or communist-backed. Many Americans fail to recognize the fact that these men of courage were more interested in ridding themselves of one foreign yoke and were not in a hurry to submit to another willingly. Their ready acceptance of aid and weapons to enable them to achieve their goal was obvious. It was only thereafter that alliances were reviewed. Experience has shown that when that review ended, the result was pragmatism. The freedom fighters, and note, I call them freedom fighters, not terrorists, were nationalists in the first instance. But many people in the Western world have labeled them as communist terrorists. Now, after digressing somewhat, let me come back to trace the history of our bilateral relations. The Nixon-Ford administration was a period of cool relationships because those administrations, in our judgment, gave succor to Portuguese colonialism in Angola and Mozambique, and to the white minority regimes in then Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe, and above all, to South Africa. the Kissinger Auction 309, which sought to legitimize the white minority regime in Rhodesia, was one great irritant in those relationships. You can then understand why the visa was not forthcoming. By this time, our revenue from the export of oil to this and other countries had made the United States Agency for International Development decide that Nigeria had reached the graduate status and therefore needed no aid from the United States. So the aid mission closed its offices in Nigeria. However, and I have to be very careful at this point, when the Carter administration came into power, the relationships warmed up considerably. It is not my intention to extol the virtues of any one administration in this country over those of another. But the truth is that it was the Carter administration which, for the first time, tried to identify African issues in and of themselves as important and to be addressed as such. That administration also seemed to understand that in order to reap the benefits of American-African interdependence, politically, economically, and in other ways, it was necessary to be sensitive to our points of view without necessarily succumbing to them. Relations were such that sufficient cognizance was taken of some of our aspirations, such as our efforts at peaceful settlement of problems created by the minority racist regimes in Southern Africa. Africa and Africans were not seen merely as a factor in the zero-sum game between the East and the West, between the Soviet Union and the United States. Consequently, there were increased economic, cultural, and political cooperation between the United States and Nigeria. We cooperated in successfully decolonizing Zimbabwe and came very close to doing the same for Namibia. We consulted very closely on global issues at the United Nations. Nigeria became a major and critical trading partner of the United States, and we have received major cooperation in expanding programs geared towards the transfer of some of your high technology into our developing economy, depending, of course, on our own resources. It is our hope that we can, with the new United States administration, not only maintain the present cordial relations between our two countries, but that we can also improve on them. One can only express a hope at this point in time, because whether jointly or severally, I and my African colleagues in the diplomatic corps in Washington, and therefore obviously our various governments, have been assured by the Reagan administration that there is an ongoing active review of the United States policy on Africa. Normally, we would await the outcome of such a review, study the resultant new position, and develop our own attitudes accordingly. That would have been the normal procedure, the normal sequence of events. However, while the review is in progress, we have seen certain seemingly irreversible steps being taken within the framework of the United States African policy. We can therefore almost predict what the final policy will be from the trend which has become discernible in the last few weeks. Because of the campaign promises of the present administration, as soon as the administration was installed, the United Nations Conference on Namibia, which was being held in Geneva between January 5 and 12, aimed at bringing a peaceful solution to the Namibian independence problem, was promptly aborted by the government of South Africa. This was obviously because of the encouraging signs from the new administration, which were perceived by South Africa as supportive of its racist policy of apartheid. And that was about the third time that the South African government had led the negotiators in this exercise up the garden path. At the end of January, South African troops moved into and raided Mozambique, killing several people on the excuse of attacking the hideouts of communist terrorists. The whole world condemned that aggression in very strong terms. But from all we could gather, the best or the most appropriate adjective that the administration could muster was, quote, unfortunate. South African military intelligence chiefs came to this country and were received officially by the U.S. ambassador at the United Nations. Yet another signal to South Africa that things are changing. We hear very often that South Africa is a friend and ally of the United States. We hear that there are many people within South Africa who are working for a change in the apartheid policy of the government, and that therefore South Africa merits both the attention and the cooperation of the United States. It also produces certain strategic minerals required by the United States. We can, of course, only conclude that the United States still regards South Africa as more important in the context of its perceived strategic importance in the East-West rivalry. More important than in the context of its unacceptable policy relative to the African majority in that country and the dignity of the black person in the other countries of Africa. We find it difficult to understand that a review which is expected to be open-ended is indeed in progress when on March the 3rd, the President himself said, among other things, and I quote, "As long as there is a sincere and honest effort being made to do away with the racial separatist policies, we should be trying to be helpful. Can we again take the other course? Can we abandon a country that has stood by us in every war we have ever fought? A country that is strategically essential to the free world in its production of minerals that we all must have?" End of quote. We are not very sure that sincere efforts are being made in South Africa to end apartheid. So we see this not as part of a new policy, but something already defined. We see it also as a confirmation of the support and indication of encouragement to that country and its reversible stance, which no review can alter. Again, towards the end of the Carter administration, there were those in Congress who tried to repeal the Clark Amendment, which prohibits covert activities by the United States CIA in Angola. At that time, when some of us protested to the administration at the attempt to repeal the amendment, we were informed that the administration never sought nor had any intention to use the powers that would be released to it by the repeal of that law. We, however, pointed out that the timing of the effort was inauspicious because of the role which Angola was playing in our negotiations to decolonize Namibia, that it would send the wrong signals to South Africa, to the Angolans, and to the rest of us in Africa. Now we hear the same demand for the repeal of the amendment, but from a different direction and in more strident notes. It is from the administration itself, because it wishes to use this freedom to support Savimbi's UNITA and to overthrow the so-called communist MPLA government and get the Cubans out of Angola. We hold no briefs at all for either the Russians or the Cubans, but the signal is clear to us. Does the new administration wish to collaborate with South Africa, condoning apartheid and racism in spite of the worldwide condemnation of that philosophy of government? Does the United States wish to sponsor and assist UNITA, a terrorist group, I repeat, to overthrow a government recognized by all the members of the Organization of African Unity? It will be very difficult for us, for any African country, and that includes Nigeria, to resist the temptation to conclude that the reviewed African policy of the United States is meant to permit the government of this country to range itself on the same side as the immoral and outcast government of South Africa against the legitimate aspirations of an African country, frustrating its efforts to consolidate its independence by whatever means it finds available to it. The Angolans themselves will see it particularly with their experience of South African incursions and invasions as a determination on the part of the US government to bring them down. It would be logical for them to be less cooperative in the search for a peaceful solution to the problems in Namibia. That kind of situation can lead not only to a continuation of the war in that country, but also to an intensification of unrest in the whole of the southern region of our continent, with all the undesirable effects attached to it. Surely, this cannot be the intention of either the Congress or the administration. Many of us in Africa who regard ourselves as friends of the United States are truly non-aligned. We will see this not just as a United States effort to contain communism worldwide and to curb the so-called Soviet and Cuban adventurism in Africa, but we will see it as giving succor to the forces of racism and oppression and prolonging our travails. The Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, designate, is currently traveling in Africa, sounding the views of African leaders before an African policy is formally fashioned out and presented to us. We hope that that policy will lead to a recognition of the need to identify and respect African and Nigerian points of view, and a willingness on the administration's part to discuss differences with us where they exist, We hope it will lead to a readiness to work with us for a peaceful solution of the South African problem by exerting sufficient pressure, economic and otherwise, on the government of that country to relinquish its illegal hold on Namibia and to set a timetable for a change in its obnoxious apartheid policy. For to the degree to which black Africans on our continent are treated as less than human, to that degree do we regard ourselves objects of racial discrimination and oppression on our own continent. To that degree also do we regard our independence curtailed and restricted. In sum, let me share with you the words of President Shehu Shagari when he was in the White House last October, and I quote, "We in Nigeria do not regard our independence as complete as long as there remains a parcel of land on the African continent which is still under foreign domination, nor shall we rest in our fight so long as racism and racial discrimination is a philosophy of government as practiced on our continent. But may I ask you, Mr. President, to let us work more closely and more diligently together to eradicate this evil which the international community has declared abominable. It is our hope that your administration and the entire American people, who have purged racism from your own society by law, will collaborate with us in doing the same by your votes at the United Nations in the case of our continent. Financial gains have only temporary advantage for those who condone apartheid to protect their profits. In the long run, when apartheid collapses, as it surely will, these investments will be in jeopardy. It is best to heed the voice of reason now and work for a peaceful change than to wait to be engulfed in a violent upheaval." End of quote. Thank you.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much for your comprehensive and forthright statement. The ambassador has agreed to answer questions, as is our custom, until about 10 minutes after 9, and we'll end promptly.
Yes, please.
During the last Israeli-Arab war, the Arabs used their oil as a bargaining lever to force European nations not to get aid to Israel. Do you expect your nation to plan to use oil as a leverage for the United States to modify its policy towards South Africa?
Now, let me be very careful about this, because I ran into hot water about this only a short while ago. When President Shagari was visiting the United States last year, he addressed the Foreign Policy Association in New York, and the questioner posed this same question to him. And I think also in an interview on television, the same question was posed. And on both occasions, his answer was, yes, we will, if we think it is necessary. Now, I didn't say it. Yes, sir.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the last question. If I'm repeating it, please forgive me. Would you care to comment on Nigeria's relations with President Sadat and the leaders of the Arab nations who violently oppose him and want his downfall because of what he did? The forgivable sin?
Well, let me back up a little. When the state of Israel occupied a part of Egypt, we, as a member of the Organization of African Unity, resolved that as long as that part of Egypt, which was part of Africa, was occupied by conquest, we were not going to maintain good relations with Israel. This was a decision of all the members of the Organization of African Unity. It was arrived at after a long debate at which the Egyptian delegates made impassioned pleas to us, to the members of the organization, to stand by them. Quite a few of the Africans were therefore not a little surprised when certain events occurred on the South Lawn of the White House here, and they were hearing of it for the first time. And this has colored, therefore, the relationships between Egypt and a lot of even the African countries. But to answer more directly, the bilateral relations between Egypt and Nigeria, we have maintained good relations with Egypt. Our view, and this permeates also our view, our stance on many African issues, it's those who are closest to the fire who know the heat. And they know why they've done this. It's like, I'm sure someone's going to throw the question at me here. What do you expect those countries that trade and do business with South Africa to do? How are you related? I mean, what's your relationship with them? And I always cite the examples of Lesotho and Botswana, who are enclaves in South Africa. We are not asking them to commit political suicide or economic suicide either. So that's our relations, our stance with Egypt.
What is your official position regarding Libyan involvement in Chad, Libya being another energy supplier of the United States?
Well, to start with, we don't import oil from Libya, so they don't have any immediate impact on us economically. But we go back to the basis of the Charter of the Organization of African Unity, in which we all agreed at its inception. We agreed on two major things. One was that we would continue to respect the boundaries which we inherited from our colonial masters until it is agreed that it is the mutual interest of the adjacent countries that those boundaries be altered. And that's the only condition envisaged in the Charter of the OAU. The second very important agreement was that we would not meddle in the internal affairs of each other. Therefore, we see the role of Libya in Chad as violating those two tenets. But we do not believe in confrontation, because we've condemned this in other circumstances in Africa. To cite one other example in which we did, we were not enamored of Idi Amin, but we did not think it was right for one country to overthrow the government of another. It's an easily done thing. Only a few weeks ago, certain troops from the Republic of Benin moved into Nigerian territory. They planted their flag, they began to demand taxes from Nigerian citizens. It will take only 5 hours, and I say this in all modesty. It will only take only 5 hours to mop up the whole territory. But we do not believe in it. And that is why we're trying to work in a peaceful manner to resolve that situation in which Libya is involved militarily in the affairs of another country. It's even very important to us because not only is Chad our northeastern neighbor, we have a large number of Chadian refugees whom we are looking after. We would like to see them go back and settle down. So we are working within the context of the Organization of African Unity peacefully to resolve the issue. Yes, sir.
There's a rumor going around in the United States that South Africa is experimenting with atomic bombs, nuclear weapons. What, if anything, are the Black African states doing as a unit to react to this? Or is there anything they can do or they perceive of themselves to be able to do militarily to meet this global threat of conflict?
I think it's the second question that we should all first address. Is there anything that severally or jointly African countries can do in the face of a nuclear arsenal being developed between or among South Africa and several of her friends, who are also friends of the United States? We know, I think everybody is now convinced that the flashes that were detected by the electronic surveillance equipment did in fact detect, those flashes were not just, they were not sparks coming out of the machine or whatever. Some nuclear device was released into the atmosphere. And we know this. But the only thing we can do is what we've always done. The African proverb says, when two elephants fight, it's the grass under their feet that suffer. So we have, over the years at the United Nations, used the moral force of public opinion to prevail on the nuclear powers to keep Africa a nuclear-free zone. This is one of the reasons they have never been able to admit to it, that they have armed South Africa with nuclear devices. And for as long as they keep denying it, we still have a chance. Yes, sir.
Mr. Ambassador, would you comment on the possibility, feasibility, or the desirability of a United States of Africa in the near or distant future? And the first parallel question, since we know that Africa is not monolithic, do you think that the cultural, specifically the linguistic, not to mention the political differences, would serve as impenetrable barriers? Second parallel question, do you consider yourself an African first, Nigerian, or a member of an ethnic group?
When the Organization of African Unity was finally formed, when it gelled in 1963, it was after a long and protracted debate as to which of the options the emerging African states would espouse. Was it the Casablanca group who said, seek ye first political unity, everything else will be added onto it. Or was it the Monrovia group that said, let us see those things that we have in common and maximize them, and we proceed from there? After the OAU was established, then the debate arose as to whether we could, in the face of the instability that was going on, border clashes, territorial skirmishes, and whatever, shouldn't we develop an African high command? A military force, a force de frappe, you call it rapid deployment force here. That would be at the disposal of the OAU to use at any given time. And our military experts went at it and studied this very closely. And they came out and said, it's not practical. You must go back into our pre-colonial history, our colonial history, to find out whether in the short term it is feasible, or in the long term it's a desirable thing. I think those are open-ended questions. We know that the Europeans have been trying for a long time. They haven't made it yet. They don't have the problems that we have to deal with, immediate problems that we have to deal with today, and yet they haven't made it. These are the considerations that will go into this. It is a desirable thing in the long run that we can work, that we should work together. Now, your more specific and personal question, whether I consider myself an African first, or a Nigerian first, or a member of an ethnic group first. I think I am one of those you describe as detribalized. It is a very, it's a word that many of us don't like, but it's used by people who describe us. I am a Nigerian first. I have grown up a Nigerian first. I live Nigerian. And if I have spent so many years being the symbol of Nigeria, I think I cannot be otherwise. And then I am an African. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Your Excellency.
Oh, my God. Oh, my
I would like very much to commend you as a Nigerian for the clarity with which you have articulated the highlights of the bilateral relationship between the United States of America and the Republic of Nigeria. I am proud for your performance tonight. Now, my question is this. President Olijimi, Julius Nyerere, made an official thought of time not long ago. And during the reception to the Palace of the Nation in Beijing, he made a statement which the newspapers, most of the press in America, buried at the back page. That if the West do not make adequate preparation to resolve the apartheid poison in South Africa, when it blows up, it's going to make the World War II as a Sunday school picnic. End of quotation. Do you think, as an ambassador of Nigeria, that the United States government, in its bilateral relationship, particularly with Nigeria, is cognizant of the significance of that state? And if so, what do you think?
First, sir, let me thank you, Professor, for your comments. I would be very presumptuous to even attempt to find out what the Americans think about that statement. For myself, I agree with President Shehu Shagari when he said, and I will repeat the quotation here, in the long run, when apartheid collapses, as it would surely do, the investments will be in jeopardy. It is better to heed the voice of reason now and work for a peaceful change than to wait to be engulfed in a violent upheaval. I think that says more or less the same thing, perhaps not so dramatically. We know that when the explosion comes, as it surely will, you cannot bury the will of 8 million people by the hands of 2 million. Thank you, sir. Yes, the lady at the back.
I'll ask you the question that you seem to be prepared for. You said that they all the way back to the economic support, but it connects with what you were saying, with what he said. I think all persons of goodwill must deplore the situation in South Africa, and the members of this organization particularly. Yet I think if it were looked into closely, most of us, I will say, have ties of some kind or another that is supporting the situation that exists there. What kind of concrete steps as individuals and as citizens of the United States can we do towards countering the situation?
You started by saying all people are goodwill. And I think a great deal of goodwill is necessary. I can stay here and talk all evening, but if you know that the dividend will be coming shortly on the diamond mines or the Krugerrand, it will take more than all the speeches I can make. We know, if you take the list of the Fortune 500, we know that there are, the first 100 of the 500, without an exception, have investments in South Africa. When Obasanjo came here in 1977, he addressed a group of top American business people, captains of industry and so on. And he laid it on the line and said, if you want to do business in Nigeria, we have got into a situation where the 80 million people within Nigeria itself and the additional 60 million people in the area of the Economic Community of West African States is a solid market. And American trade and business in that market is larger than that of South Africa. Is that with South Africa. Therefore, if you want to do business with us, go check your records in South Africa. We have set up a council which monitors those companies that operate in Nigeria, and we know what they are doing. If you are increasing your investments, then we'll tell you to move. So we've tied that in without trying to browbeat anyone, without pulling anyone to our views. We've just said, you have a market here, you have a market there. Take your choice. And when Barclays Bank, for instance, did not want to make the choice, we helped them to make the choice. When British Petroleum did not want to make the choice, we helped them to make the choice. They're still trying to negotiate compensation from us for taking over their establishment in Nigeria. But we did that. These are some of the things that certain African countries can do. But as I said, as you get closer to it, the heat gets greater. And we cannot ask Malawi, we cannot ask Lesotho, we cannot ask Botswana to do the same with South Africa or with any company that's doing business in South Africa. That was why I referred in the main text of my statement to a timetable. We're not saying pack your baggage today and move. That is unrealistic. I've talked with some of the big companies here, and we understand where they're coming from. But we want a demonstration of their willingness to go along with us. Yes, sir.
Mr. Ambassador, in terms of approaching this change for South Africa, and your point seems to be one of not confrontation, but rather moral persuasion and so on. Do you think the efforts made by people such as Dr. Leon Sullivan with the 6 principles, and also the kind of corporate pressure that the United States churches are putting on corporations in South Africa, is the kind of pressure that will eventually bring about change in attitude?
My question in answering that is, how much change, how much good has it done? You still have the Sowetos. You still have the social disruption in which a family is perforce separated because the man cannot live where he works. He cannot belong to a trade union. Therefore, he cannot bargain for himself. These are some of the more fundamental things than the cosmetics of integrated washrooms and integrated beaches. The more fundamental things have not been touched, and this is where the problem is. Yes, the gentleman in brown.
As a Nigerian myself, as an African, and as somebody who studied here, and also happened to work in the field of computers in this country, where knowledge is taken to be an essential part of growth. I found myself confronted a lot of times with people from different parts of this country. When I talk about it, when they ask me where I'm from, simply because of my accent, and I mention Nigeria, a lot of them say, "You're from Africa? That country?" Okay. I mentioned that simply to bring a line that what do you, as chief diplomat in this country or Nigeria, perceive as a matter of information from the American government or from the American press, the American media, to the matter of educating the public about Africa, Nigeria, or any other country for that matter, what it stands for, what the policies are, as far as relating to that continent as it should be, instead of relating to it as a group, or as a continent where people don't have anything to eat or anything. Do you perceive that the government or the media is doing enough to educate people in this respect? Or do you think that the American government is making every effort to demonstrate the importance of Nigeria or Africa in this area?
I think we must be honest and be fair. I do not see that it is the responsibility of the American government to educate its people about us. On the other hand, I fully understand where the problem comes from. To start with, this is a multiracial country. And the history of that is still with us. In order to justify that situation, the Tarzan image still persists. You are on a whole continent here, which is also one country. Therefore, mentally, to the average, and I repeat average, Mr. or Mrs. America, the equation is simple. Africa, United States. You try to buy a shortwave transistor radio in this country, you'll have to go to 10 stores before you find one that carries it. Because they are interested in the news around themselves. Who wants to hear what's happening in Africa unless they are killing each other? Who wants to hear what's happening in Afghanistan except that the Soviet Union has moved in there? There is an inward-looking attitude. A friend of mine who's American explained it to me once. He said, when you stop teaching geography in the 7th grade, what do you expect? So it is a question of education. It is a question of the horizon being limited. I once went on a trip to a farm in Kentucky, and I stayed with a family who had 2 sons in medical school, and one was practicing dentistry already. And I had to stay with them for 3 days. I drove the tractor on the farm. I milked cow for the first time. I really was one of the family. The 10-year-old boy, the last day that I was leaving, posed for a photograph with me. And then went to his mother and said, you know, he's not like an ambassador, he's like a friend. And his mother said, what do you mean, Jan? He said, I didn't think Africans looked like this. Because this was his first exposure. Now, how many Africans can we bring in to be exposed to 220 million Americans? When I first came out to this country in 1965, I was answering certain questions. I went back, and I've been back since 1977. I am still answering those same questions. Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Ambassador, I think my question is a good one to follow his question. The American dollar seems to be going down on open market. Would you care to comment on how the Nigerian dollar compares to the American?
To start with, we don't use the dollar. All right. That was a problem that we had at one time. When I was badgered by people here, you Nigerians, you hiking the price of oil every day. And why? And I tried to explain that at one time, the price of 1 barrel of oil was just enough to buy 3 bottles of Coca-Cola. And they couldn't take this. They wouldn't believe it, but it was true. One additional reason that the price of oil had been going up was that, as I said in the presentation, we are a developing country. We're plowing back into our development programs all the revenue that we get from the oil. But if we were dealing directly with the United States alone, it would be no great problem, because it's the dollar that we get that we will spend. But our development projects involve a worldwide cooperation. We have just completed one oil factory. It was built for us by a Japanese consortium. They quoted us the figures in the yen. They won't quote it in the dollar because they know that the dollar is going down. So we have to dip our hands into the kitty deeper and deeper in order to pay. The Germans are building our roads. They quote us the figures in Deutschmarks. When the deal is sealed, maybe it's 1 million Deutschmarks, which perhaps was $500,000, I don't know. But by the time we have to pay, that is already much less in the dollar. So we have to still go in and dip our hands in. So we're having that problem, the problem of indexing. I think this is the word the economists use. Our resources to the price to what we get for it from our buyers. And so we have this problem exists. And we've been trying to adjust this in a long while. One of the other problems that we have is that this is generally not known. Again, it's something that gives me sleepless nights. The United States has the largest trade deficit with Nigeria, not with Japan, not with the United Kingdom, not with any other country, but with Nigeria. And I am in the business of trying to reduce that imbalance. So we have that problem. We have so many dollars there, and we have to bring back some naira into the United States.
I've often thought that being prompt is one of life's great hurdles, which I've never leaped over. And it's especially difficult to attempt it when it's clear that the audience is absolutely fascinated by the speaker. And I know you have many more questions. But let me apologize to all of you for attempting to come close to being prompt. We don't want to impose too much upon your time. You're most generous, Mr. Ambassador. We thank you very much for being with us and being so forthright.